This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, MICHAEL COVEL. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. My guest today has been called by the Wall Street Journal one of the world's most influential business thinkers. Forbes has called him the world's leading expert on business strategy. And I got to tell you, for his newest book, every major player that any author would ever want to say nice words about a book, they say it about my guest today, about his newest book. My guest today is Gary Hamel. He is a management consultant, American management consultant. And he is very well known for his long-standing teaching relationship with the London Business School. Today we dive into a word, one that is, I don't want to say near and dear to me, but one that I really despise, the word bureaucracy. How much economic activity is lost because of bureaucracy? And Gary, in his newest work, his newest book, goes right at this word, bureaucracy. His answer? Humanocracy. He flips the whole thing on its head. Now, I'm sure there'll be some people that will say, oh, that's awesome. And some people will say, no way. I want to be open-minded. I want to look for these new ways, the new thinking. Because just the standard issue, bureaucracy, whether we see it in a company or government, every time we experience it, we all just pull our hair out. What hair we have left. Without any further delay, let's jump right into my conversation with Gary Hamel. Gary, before we jump into your world today, I want to take you back in time because, I've got these papers in front of me and there are so many names that are giving you praise. Now, look, I've written some books and I know how getting names to talk about stuff, but this isn't just the regular group of names. So you've really had an interesting career, clearly, but I want you to take me back in time to a young Gary. I want to know what the start is. We could all look in right now. Okay, I can see everything. Tell me you at 16, 17, 18, what were you thinking? What was your mindset? Did you have a path then? Was there some big moment? Was there a mentor? What put you down the direction where you are today?
I guess I should first of all say I grew up in an academic family. My dad was a university professor and a very inquisitive family and always encouraging us to think and very interesting dinner table conversations. So I always knew I wanted a career that kind of honored the life of the mind in a way. My parents were also entrepreneurs, faculty, but also had built a very successful business. And I also saw that, and I saw how hard they worked and the kind of difference that a business can make to a family. So those were certainly kind of defining moments, kind of number one. I think secondly, after I finished my MBA, my first real job was as a hospital administrator out in California. I'd grown up in Michigan. I enjoyed it, but probably after the first few weeks, I realized that this wasn't for me. Going to the same committee meetings week after week, spending a career kind of sucking up and playing that game just seemed, I have to say, tedious. So I knew I wanted to go back into academia. I applied to the University of Michigan because I wanted to be back home close to family, got back to the PhD program there. And that was in the late 1970s, Michael. And that was really the first time in history where, or at least in modern industrial history, where American companies were really taken to school by their foreign competitors. And principally, that was the Japanese competitors at that time. They had pretty much decimated the American consumer electronics industry, companies like RCA and Sylvania and so on. And US companies basically gotten out of that industry. Then they came after the auto industry, and I saw what happened in Detroit and the community hollowed out and people losing their jobs. And two things really struck me out of that experience that stuck with me for a long time. One was I realized that what was happening was not inevitable. There was a consequence of poor choices. There was arrogance and denial and nostalgia on the part of people who had probably too much of their emotional equity invested in the past, were unwilling to admit that there was maybe a better way of doing things. And one signature moment came when I was inside of Ford. I can't remember why I was there. Maybe I was consulting, but I was inside of Ford, and Dr. Edward Demings, the great pioneer of the quality movement, was talking to a group of Ford leaders, and I happened to be in the room. And somebody asked them, when do you think we'll catch Toyota? And he gave us like only an 80-year-old can do. And he said, well, maybe never. He said, they aren't standing still. I understood the importance of leadership and management and how if you get it wrong, you can really undermine a business. And the other side of it was seeing the personal consequences and seeing these cities and towns hollowed out, people losing their jobs, families pulled apart. It gave me this profound sense of how vulnerable businesses were and how important they are in people's lives, and that we got to get this right. Those were the events, really, I would say, that set me down that course of understanding why do companies succeed and fail. I guess another thing that came along at about that time, when I first started teaching, Michael Porter had just published a very influential book called Competitive Strategy. What he set out to do, and did so brilliantly, and I would forever stand on his shoulders, but he set out to explain, why do some companies make more money than others? What's a good strategy and a bad strategy? And I remember reading that and finding it very impressive, but at the end of it also asking two questions was, all right, I understand why one company may make more money than another, there are barriers to entry and so on. But what I really want to know is, where does a groundbreaking strategy come from? And I can't remember what the entrepreneurs were at the time, but maybe it was Compaq or maybe it was Dell. I don't remember. But where do these new ideas come from? And then secondly, how do you change a strategy once it's reached its sell-by date? Those became also very important questions for me. How do you encourage, how do you find the next groundbreaking idea? And if you're a very successful company, how do you avoid the downside of success? As I used to say, success is a self-limiting phenomenon. Those have become two of the questions that really occupied me for a lot of years to come.
You mentioned academia and academia for a long time. The description you gave of what you were trying to avoid, I can't say that I've got too much experience in academia other than getting my BA and MBA. But I would think that many people might think that the things that you thought you could avoid would be the very things that you would face in academia. So I listened to your voice. We've never spoken before, and I can feel this high energy guy who's going to bring it. If you walk into a room, you're going to cause people to pause. And did your personality, how did you navigate academia to get to the place where you want it to be, where you can make a difference?
I guess one of the things I liked about academia, after I finished my PhD program, I went to the London Business School. It was a fairly young business school. It wasn't hidebound at all. It was a very young group of very ambitious people. It was nominally attached to the University of London, but it was amazingly independent. So it had almost no institutional baggage around it. So that was a godsend. And because they didn't have a huge endowment, they had to be relevant out in the world of business all the time. That was just fortuitous and wonderful. But I figured that academia was the closest you could be to like an anarchist and still get a paycheck. As long as you showed up a couple of times a week to teach your MBA students and they enjoyed what you're doing, nobody told you what you needed to research. They didn't tell you when you had to be sitting at your desk. You didn't really have a boss. If your students and your peers thought you're okay, the dean left you alone almost entirely. That was just like this wonderful thing. It wasn't without responsibility. I remember realizing after my first term that at the end of the term, every student was going to give me a rating, and every one of those would be visible. At that time, this wasn't done online, but all of those would be visible in the library, and everybody would know exactly what people thought of me. Of course, once you start to publish and that goes out to peer review, that's somebody saying, did you do a good job or not? It was fairly brutal. It was a very performance-oriented culture, but there really wasn't much bureaucracy. And I thrived in that. I loved doing the executive education. I started that very, very young, teaching executives. I had enormous empathy for what it was like to be in an organization struggling to get things done. And I felt academia was a wonderful place, but that was the London Business School at that time. I think I would struggle in a large state university somewhere where there are more administrators than faculty.
Let me take you to the word. You brought it up for the first time. I can't say it's a word that I love, but I feel like I've got a decent feel for it. maybe not in the current modern corporate structure, but especially in the government structure, the American government structure. And I think this word bureaucracy is a word that you want to take the chainsaw to it and just take it out to the graveyard. And I salute you for that. But boy, is it something that is so ingrained and tied through so much culture. And if we're talking specifically American culture, American corporate culture, American government, I still shake my head these days if I walk into a United States post office and just make casual observations of everything going on. You just want to pull your hair out. And I imagine, I'm looking at your fine book here, and I was looking at this one statistic where you say, 13% of employees around the world are fully engaged in their work, which kind of speaks to massive bureaucracy. Speak to that word, though. When did you first have the epiphany of, gosh, I really want to fight this?
It was a slow dawning, but here's more or less what happened. As my work gained a certain, credibility, I started doing more and more work with companies. I think at one point I had worked with almost every company in the Dow Jones Index in one way or the other. They were all deep engagements, but I was inside them. I got to know a lot of these organizations. What struck me, Michael, is they all suffered from a similar set of disabilities. Many years ago, I wrote a paper called The Core Competence of the Organization. And what I was discovering was the core incompetence of the corporation. Because whatever the industry and whatever the country, large, medium, even small, organizations suffered from the same disabilities. They tended to be inertial. It was very difficult to get them to change in any profound way. And change usually came in the midst of a crisis after they'd been humbled, and often required a coup. It often required a leadership change, and a new group of executives would come in and they would set the organization on a new course. They're like, why is it so difficult for these organizations to see the future and change in time? The second disability was that they were incremental. By this time, I'm living in Silicon Valley, and I'm seeing all these young companies tear up the rule book, and it was almost never the incumbents. They struggled with game-changing innovation, even though every CEO said it was important. And the third thing I realized was that many, many people in these organizations were entirely dispirited. They really weren't showing up with their best selves, and the Gallup data certainly bore that out. The question becomes, when you see this again and again and again, like, why? How can this be? And I remember working in organizations where we go in, we train hundreds, sometimes thousands of people to think like business thinkers. We created billions of dollars of market value, in some sense, very, very successful. But yet when I'd come back a year or two later, what we'd started was now stale. Bureaucracy had reinserted itself. That innovative spirit had been squelched again. Once you see this again and again, you start to say, okay, there's something here that is much deeper than any individual organization. There's something almost at a DNA level that is incapacitating these organizations. So that sent me back to understand the history of management. What do all these organizations have in common? Then you go back and you slowly unpack it, and you realize that virtually every organization, public sector, private sector, large, small, is built kind of against the same template. I think about it as a mashup of military command structures that go all the way back in human history, and then the disciplines of industrial engineering that really started with Frederick Taylor, to be called scientific management. You had the architecture, that was the command and control, the pyramid. If you wanted to get an idea, to get support, you had to fight your way up that gauntlet and get somebody at the top to say, yes, this is okay. And unfortunately, though, the people at the top mostly loved the old thing and not the new thing. Then there was an ideology, and that was the ideology of industrial engineering or controlism. What, of course, Taylor had set out to do, and he was very blunt about this, was to make sure everybody was doing exactly the same thing in the same way, the one best way. Both of those structures, the architecture, the pyramid, the hierarchy, and then these disciplines of industrial engineering, which is all about cheaper, better, faster, and all the controlism that came with that, those had served us very well. But I could see that, kind of like every technology, this was a technology of its time, and the world had shifted. Bureaucracy, with those authoritarian power structures and all those rule choke processes, bureaucracy was invented in an age where the average employee didn't even have a high school education, where information was very expensive to move and aggregate. And the best way of doing that was having 10 people report up to one person. Then at that level, you'd aggregate again and then report up. So indeed, the CEO was the only person with the whole picture. But it was built at a time when information was expensive to move, when change in the world was fairly glacial. And yet we were living in a time when all of those things were different. And yet that technology was still there. I started to dig into that and realized that bureaucracy was the template for every large organization. Wherever I went in, I found the same things. Power trickled down, big leaders appointed little leaders, strategy was set at the top, powerful staff groups issued rules and enforced conformance, managers assigned tasks, and assessed employees, and everybody was competing for the scarce resource of promotion. And you go like, okay, so like what problem was this thing designed to solve? And again, you go back and you unpack it and you realize this was an immense kind of social technology that was invented to get control. And by the way, that's a very important thing. Now as then, I think we tend to forget that. But if you think of an iPhone where you'll have a system on a chip inside of that iPhone that's probably now done at maybe 7 nanometers and the next generation 5 nanometer scale, that's the length your fingernail will grow in the next few seconds. You need a lot of control over a lot of variables to do that. But it was also clear that wasn't enough anymore. We lived in a world where every organization was perpetually teetering on the brink of irrelevance. What really mattered was not simply scale, but whether you can innovate and remake customer expectations, and where you needed every employee to be an inspired problem solver. And it was clear that bureaucracy did none of those things and in fact worked against them. Perhaps one other insight came with that kind of historical review as well, Michael. I went back with my colleagues and we looked at the last 60 years of organizational innovation. And a lot of this would have happened before many of our listeners are even alive. But we went back and looked at T groups, transformation groups in the 60s, and self-management in the 70s, the total quality movement in the 80s, and so on, all the way up to agile teams and mindfulness. And what you found is that many of these initiatives produced extraordinary results at some small scale in a factory, but none of them stuck around. They all ultimately were marginalized or aborted in some way. And none of them had really made a fundamental difference to the nature of our organizations. So in a sense, they'd all been cosmetic. So again, it pushes you to go back and to say, okay, what's really at the heart of this? And you ultimately discover it's a set of principles. It's the principles of standardization and stratification, specialization, formalization. And these principles have been embedded and woven into every bit of our thinking and systems and processes, and we're stuck there. And that you're really not going to change anything fundamental until you start with a new set of principles. So it was a long journey. I wish I could say it just was a sudden spark of inspiration. It wasn't, but I realized, you know what, human beings built this. This is not a cosmological constant, and maybe we can rebuild it.
Let me read this back to you, a sentence from your world. Humanocracy is for every rebel who's run out of patience with bureaucratic bullshit, believes every team member should have the chance to learn, grow, and contribute, and is ready to do their part to hack management. In a way, when I read that and you say, okay, Silicon Valley, where you are right now, in many ways, and you mentioned earlier too, your entrepreneurial upbringing, or at least part of your upbringing, it almost feels like you're prescribing for the corporate world to think of their employees in a way as venture capital investments. Let them have the control, let them operate some autonomy and to go do things. Speak to this. I mean, like terms like bureaucratic bullshit. I mean, what happens when you walk in to the corporate boardrooms? I mean, obviously they're paying attention to you now. You've got some gravitas, but speak to this humanocracy, the bureaucratic bullshit. I mean, these terms, they kind of jump off at you, and it's just not something we hear a lot today.
I hope I don't upset any EVPs, but maybe it's inevitable. Here's the interesting thing. A lot of the CEOs I talk to and meet around the world, they get this now. They don't know exactly what to do. But I think what's changed is this. 20 years ago, they were working on optimizing the operating model. So they're all installing CRM systems and ERP systems and working to make logistics and back office and supply chains more efficient and more agile. And that was fantastic. A decade ago, and this is definitely ongoing, they shifted from trying to optimize the operating model to digitize the business model. And obviously, almost every incumbent got caught behind that. And right now, for a lot of the consulting companies, like quotes digital transformation is some big business, which is interesting because digital is not that hard, but a lot of companies missed it because it challenged some fundamental assumptions about how their businesses work that they were reluctant to give up. And yet, I think what most CEOs will say today is the real problem, the deep problem, is not the operating model, it's not the business model. The real problem is the management model. We have too many layers, we're too slow, we're too insular, too conservative, and they're not sure how to fix it, but they definitely know that it is suffocating their organization. But there's a tension in all of this because I believe to build fundamentally more capable organizations, you do have to reallocate power. And if you've spent your life kind of climbing the greasy pole of bureaucracy, if you learn how to play that game, if you're like a level 10 player of the bureaucratic game. You know how to negotiate targets, manage up, deflect blame, hoard resources, and so on. And somebody tells you, hey, the most successful organizations in the world are going to have almost no middle managers at all. They're going to be extraordinarily flat, that will have deeply empowered teams, that we're going to disaggregate big things into small things. This is very kind of uncomfortable. So I think CEOs are both aware but also anxious, because what does it really mean to make this jump? As you suggest, Michael, I think we are up against a set of challenges today in the world, whether it is COVID, racial injustice, the employment threat of automation, mass economic migration, climate change, whatever it is. And of course, a ton of new opportunities that are made possible by synthetic biology and 5G and nanomaterials and so on. But we're in a world where we cannot afford to waste any human imagination, any human initiative. And yet you mentioned the Gallup data, and that's kind of the tip of the iceberg. You start to look at this data and you discover that only 1 out of 5 employees believes their ideas really matter at work, that only 1 out of 10 feels they can experiment and try new things, that 70% of jobs in the US are deemed to require little or no originality. And again, you go like, how did we end up in a world where most organizations waste more human capacity than they use? And I think that is simply becoming unaffordable and untenable. It's competitively untenable. It's untenable economically. It's not kind of unrelated that you both see increasing bureaucracy around the world. The bureaucratic class gets bigger and bigger. It's kind of self-perpetuating, and productivity growth is falling, with all the implications that has for declining middle class and more pressure on incomes and more income inequality. Whether it's just, I got to innovate fast, I need to solve problems that are faster than my competitors, or whether it's, we have to get this productivity engine going again. We simply can't afford organizations that treat human beings as resources and assume that commodity jobs are filled with commodity people. A lot of the examples and the stories we tell in the book are sometimes relatively pedestrian organizations, a steel maker, a bank, a tomato processor, but that have turned on the capabilities of every employee and reap the benefits of that. Maybe in the past it was a little bit optional to think about these things, but less and less.
I grew up in the Washington, D.C. area, so when you talk about labels and people moving up the bureaucratic ladder, I mean, if I can think back to how many times I listened to government employees talk about where they stood on the GS scale, and the implication being that they had climbed, as you say, the greasy pole of bureaucracy. I'm going to write that one down and put it on my wall. That's just a beautiful phrase, the greasy pole of bureaucracy. It really is an amazing thing that we are at this day and age. And you put the number, what do you say? If we could get past bureaucracy, you say 9 trillion in lost economic output each year. I tell you what, give an example. You pick the example, you pick the company. Walk us through you walking into an environment, either hands-on or from a distance, where you observe a particular company, you come in and you help them through from this ground up DNA level that you're talking about to make the change, to make the shift. Paint the picture in my audience's mind about what it means to leave bureaucracy and get to what you are calling a humanocracy.
Let me start just by quickly and very simply defining terms. For me, bureaucracy is a set of systems, processes, and so on, which are designed to maximize conformity. Humanocracy is a way of maximizing contribution. So there's the simple difference. Where bureaucracy looks at the institution as the thing that hires individuals to produce products, profits, whatever it may be, services. And in that rendering, the human being is an instrument. They are an instrument of the institution. Humanocracy turns that around and says, no, individuals join institutions to make a difference in the world and to earn a living, but it is the institution that's the instrument, not the human being. So that said, I think if you want to make this shift, and I'll kind of lay it out in blocks, and then if we want, we can get deep about like, what do you do as a lone individual to start to push back against the tide here? But I think, first of all, you have to have motivation. You have to believe that we really are at a point where bureaucracy has to die. And the thing is, as you say, we've tried to lay out some of these costs in the book. I think our calculations hold up. We've had a lot of people look at them. We think that if we achieve these gains over the next decade across the OECD, it would double the recent productivity growth rates and probably is a bigger productivity dividend than any other policy initiative on the horizon, whether that's incentives for capital investment, upskilling workers, then nothing else is going to come close to the gains we get if we could even reduce the bureaucratic load by half. So you first of all have to have the motivation to do this. And as you would know, Michael, bureaucrats, managers, leaders, they tend to pay attention to things that can be measured. And in most organizations, nobody is measuring bureaucratic drag or what we call bureausclerosis. You may have a sense, yeah, we have too many layers and maybe the staff groups are a little bloated, but nobody's actually measuring how much distortion do we have in decisions because people are managing up and bending the facts on the ground, the prejudices of their leaders. Or how much decision lags do we have because so many people have to weigh in and sign off before something gets done? Or how much insularity do we have because we have so much process that people spend a huge amount of their days fighting internal battles rather than looking outward. So we've constructed some metrics and some tools so we can start to dimensionalize that. And these are all free. If somebody goes to hbr.org, harvardbusiness.org, puts in my name and puts in BMI, Bureaucratic Mass Index, you can take this, go back and start to look at your own organization and get a baseline. But first, we have to measure these things. A decade or two ago, very few companies measured or calculated their environmental impact. Now many do. And I think we need to do the same here. And stakeholders of all sorts need to hold leaders accountable for reducing their bureaucratic mass index. That's one. You got to get motivated. And part of that is getting the numbers and getting the data. And part of that is just trading some of our indifference for indignation. We've been around this for so long that we just kind of assume that this is the way work life has to be, that Gallup data hasn't changed in generations. And we somehow just like have learned to accept that. And like we shouldn't. That's just unconscionable. I think the second thing, once you have a bit of fire in your belly, the second thing is to say, now we need some models. Most of us are kind of conservative, and we're not going to really sign up for something unless we can see a bit of the destination. The good news is there are some organizations out there, we profile many of them in the book, that have basically gone bureaucracy free. They've learned how to buy the benefits of bureaucracy, the control and the coordination, the consistency. They do it duty free. I could give you a bunch of examples. Let me give you one. And then if you want, we'll take another one. But I think of Buurtzorg, which is the largest home health organization in the Netherlands. They employ about 16,000 nurses and caregivers. Those 16,000 are divided into more than 1,100 self-managing teams. The folks in those teams have responsibility for finding office space, hiring staff, winning clients, improving the quality and so on of their service. Everyone is its own P&L with real decision authority. So you have an organization of 16,000 people. They're all united by a technology platform that allows them to trade best practices, to collaborate around big issues and so on. So there's a lot of coordination and collaboration that goes on. But in this organization, if you looked at their administrative personnel, they have 36 coaches. These are literally on-demand coaches. Nobody reports to them. They have 50 people at head office, mostly working in IT, and they have 2 line managers, one of which is the founder, Jos de Blok. So you go like, okay, and by the way, they won Dutch Employer of the Year 5 years in a row. They beat every competitor on every single metric of performance. And yet you're running a company where the span of control is 1 to 8,000. So you look at that and you tell me, okay, now I have to say to the company I work, like, now let's go back to you. The burden of proof is now on you to tell me why you need 6 layers or to tell me, why? This is only one model. There are many others. But you do need to kind of look at these and be convinced that something else is possible. When the explorers from Spain and Portugal first arrived in the so-called New World, they found that the Native Americans had not, or the indigenous people, had not yet invented the wheel. You think of like, what's your experience if you've been dragging stuff behind you for a few millennia, and then one day you see the wheel, you go like, holy crap, why didn't we think of that? That's been my experience going inside of some of these organizations. Like, guys, it doesn't have to be this way. There's an alternative. And these companies, on average, dramatically outperform their peers.
If you walk into an organization, and you start to introduce, and this is my term a little bit, my thinking, you start to introduce this entrepreneurial mindset throughout the company, throughout the organization, from lowest to highest employee staff, they have this thinking, they have this feeling of empowerment. And people start to get used to that. They get this entrepreneurial juice inside of them. What about the compensation? Does that start to play a role if the entire organization starts to have this non-bureaucratic thinking, this entrepreneurial type thinking where they have control all the way down the ladder? But if the compensation stays top down, for example, I catch the news headlines every now and again to hear how many more billions that Jeff Bezos has made in a particular day. And now I'm not knocking Jeff at all, because I think it's fabulous that he started this company, and it's fabulous that he's had all this success. That's what capitalism is all about. But the gap is massive between the top and the bottom. How do you address this issue that if you're going to bring this style of thinking in to empower people to where they might at some stage of the game start to feel like, wow, I've got all this power. I'm doing a lot more work now. I'm thinking, I'm involved a lot more, but gee, I'm so far away from the top in terms of compensation.
Super good point, Michael. A few thoughts. First of all, the wage differential between CEOs and frontline workers, it goes up and down a bit over time, but it's somewhere between about 250 and 350, depending on how you measure in a particular year. I really have a hard time believing that the folks at the top are 350 times smarter than the people at the bottom. And the mere fact that you have, let's say, 10,000 people reporting to you rather than 100 does not necessarily make your job that much more complex. And what we know from a lot of research is that CEOs actually are no better at making big decisions than anybody else. It's not like they're super prescient or super smart or whatever. So what basically happened is our organizations today are kind of an administrative aristocracy. We pay people, as you were saying, and not only in the government, generally we pay people by kind of rank, by their position, which is largely based on the size of your organization, the size of your budget. But mostly, these are all administrators all the way up. There was a time 100 years ago and more when administrative competence was very rare, when we were starting to bring thousands of people to work and you needed this new super employee called a manager to wrangle all those people, to set budgets and design work and tasks and assess performance and identify variances. At the time, that was a very unique set of skills. It's like if today maybe you were a data scientist or geneticist, and it was pretty exotic. Business schools got created to train these new people called managers. But today, not much of that work is very exotic anymore. And in most companies, it is not the work that's actually creating most of the value. It's interesting, when I was in Nucor, by far the most consistently profitable, successful, most innovative steel company in America and one of the most in the world, and you talk to their senior leaders and they will tell you being a manager here is the least noble work. The real nobility is people on the front lines, in coveralls, in hard hats, who are making big capital decisions, who are running experiments every day, who are talking to customers, who are inventing new products. And Nucor is divided into about 100 operating units, each with their own P&L, divided into small teams within them. They have less than half the managers you'd find in a typical company of that size, a head office of only 100 employees. So I think, yes, when you start to build a more entrepreneurial company, you have to change the compensation. What it means to be an entrepreneur is two things. It means, number one, you have autonomy, you have freedom to make meaningful business decisions. And number two, you have a shot at the brass ring, you have financial upside. If you look, for example, at Nucor, those employees on the front lines, every time they raise productivity, it shows up in their paycheck. They are not afraid of automation at all, because they know when they find ways of automating, capital productivity goes up, those gains go back to those employees, or much of that gain goes back to those employees. Hire, which I talk about in Japan, the largest domestic appliance company in the world with 80,000 employees, they divided that company into 4,000 micro enterprises. And in those little businesses, you have entrepreneurial teams that have 3 decision rights. They call them rights. You have the right to set strategy, the right to hire and fire, and the right to distribute rewards. And the compensation system there is such that if you meet fairly aggressive targets, you can multiply your base compensation several times over. I don't know how to build a humanocracy without redistributing authority, and I don't know how to build one without also redistributing, in some sense, the rewards. When you look across these organizations, without exception, they pay more than the competitors. They all pay substantially better salaries than competitors, not because they're kind of just generous, but because their people are creating a ton more value, because they've trained them, they've equipped them, they've taught them to think like business innovators, they've taught them to think like business people, they've entrusted them with critical decisions. And it's that energy down there on the ground, close to customers, close to competitors, that drives the success of these firms.
You'll have to correct me if I paraphrase anything wrong or say anything wrong, but listening to you talked about making decisions, that there's not necessarily a way that we can say the higher ups make better decisions than the frontline folks, which I think speaks to the notion of experimentation, which is obviously the heart of Silicon Valley. I don't think so many people really wrap their arms, or you mentioned experimentation in your answer there earlier, but I don't think people necessarily think about how important experimentation is, because at the end of the day, the guy at the top doesn't necessarily know either. So it's a matter of trying many things, knowing from the beginning. I mean, back to David Ricardo in the 1700s. You got to let your winners run, cut your losses. You just don't know what's going to be the home run. So you have to have the ability, the autonomy, the authority to try many things, knowing from the beginning, a bunch of it's not going to work. And that's kind of a really quality decision-making process versus what a lot of people probably still think is somebody in an ivory tower who just speaks from on high, telling everybody how it is. And I've got so much experience and I know it's going to go this way. And it's just not the modern world.
It's just not the modern world. And yet we cling to that. I heard, and I'm not going to embarrass him by telling his name, but he's a very well-respected CEO who led one of the most, a very large and venerable Fortune 500 company. And he said, I think he said this in the pages of Harvard Business Review a couple of years back, he said, there are opportunities that only the CEO can see and decisions that only the CEO can make. And I have to say, I think that's just utter rubbish. All the evidence says, Michael, that the primary reason organizations get into trouble is when the world is changing faster than a small group of leaders can unlearn and relearn. When you have people at the top who are supposedly responsible for strategy and direction, who are unable to write off their own depreciating intellectual capital. It happened under Gates in the latter years of Gates' reign, and then under Ballmer. There was about a 20-year period when Microsoft was late to literally every single opportunity that came along.
Hold on, that's a huge mouthful when you say that. A 20-year period when one of the most successful companies ever was late, but clearly you and I could go through the examples. How many other tech companies walked into the tech space and did novel innovation that became great businesses when Microsoft had all the money and all the power and should have owned many of these businesses?
Go back 20 years and the same movie played out with IBM, where in about a 10-year period, IBM's market value as a share of the global computer industry market value went from 50% to 10%, missed a whole string of opportunities. And again, I'm not picking on any one company. These companies are filled with super smart people. A lot of them are my friends. But when you vest the responsibility for strategy and direction at the top, you are giving a very small number of people the ability to hold the company's capacity to change hostage to their own personal willingness to adapt and change. I came across a talk by some guy who works for NBC Universal, I guess part of Comcast now, but big television company. This was 2016, so 4 years ago. This guy is talking, I think he was the head of media research. So this is the guy who's supposed to have the crystal ball, looking at the future of the media world, and he's talking to a lot of their advertisers, their customers. And again, I'll paraphrase, I'm 90% going to have this right. He said, Netflix is interesting, but doesn't have enough good content, and YouTube is a sideshow. Already in 2016, if you were between 18 and 30, you were getting a majority of your video content from streaming. This wasn't something that you had to look 20, this was already happening. But what I've learned is that organizations miss the future, not because it's unpredictable, they miss it because it's unpalatable. That's where this point of experimentation comes back. Jeff Bezos, interestingly, as successful as the guy is, and I'm sure inside he's treated as royalty, and you probably have to have a lot of guts to take him on in an argument. Having said that, he said, I want to build a company that's the world's biggest laboratory. We're just going to try more things. And he said that if you know something is going to succeed at the outset, it's not an experiment. And there are companies, we talk about Intuit in the book, which has been amazingly successful in financial software and has outperformed the market. And they teach every single employee design thinking. They teach every single employee how to do rapid prototyping and experimentation. They say, we are never going to make decisions based on PowerPoint and models and analysis. Build something, take it out, test it with competitors, get real data, come back, tell us what you're learning, and then we'll see if we're going to go forward. It's the same thing at Hire, where they make it extremely easy for somebody to start a new business. I think experimentation is the fuel for renewal, and it always has been. I mean, as human beings, we're the product of 4 billion years of genetic experimentation with gene drift and mutation and sexual recombination, and it's the same thing inside of organizations. I was actually making this point once. One of my brothers, Michael, he's a physician. I use the analogy of oak trees. We have a lot of live oaks in California. They spread acorns all over the ground, and only a few germinate. The oak tree does not know where the fertile ground is. These acorns are search strategy. And I said, that's the same thing you need in a company. The CEO does not know where the opportunities are. And my brother said, let me give you a better analogy. He said, Gary, he said, when a man and a woman make a baby in the old-fashioned way, all but one of millions of sperm get wasted. But if the goal is to create a new life, you don't worry about all the little swimmers who didn't get there. And he said, what you're really saying is that a lot of large companies have a very low sperm count. And I said, well, I'm not sure I can use that analogy, but yeah, that's basically it.
I still prefer the old-fashioned way. I'm not sure what the new-fashioned way is, but I'm just going to, without getting into the details, I think the old-fashioned way is still pretty cool. Hey, let me pick your mind a little bit about something very current right now. And it's so current that we don't necessarily know how things are going to flesh out. But I'm jotting down some notes here, and I was thinking office space, distance, COVID. This is a real potential game changer. Maybe we get past this COVID time and we all get back to the office space. But it's an interesting conundrum that we've got this thing where now we potentially need distance for a long time, but then we've got a way, unlike 30, 40 years ago, unlike then, we now have this connective tissue across the lines, so to speak, to really bring people together. It's an interesting time, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting time. As you say, and I would agree, it's a little too early to say what is temporary here and what is long term. But I think a couple of things you probably are safe to say. One is, I think this is another really tough reminder, if one was needed, that bureaucracies are not very good at rapid and unprecedented change. One of the leaders of the Italian healthcare system said, the virus moves faster than our bureaucracy. And I wanted to add, yeah, well, so does everything else. But you see the CDC at the moment trying to kind of retain its spot at the top of American healthcare and filled with NIH and wanting to develop its own COVID test rather than take one that had already been developed by WHO. And you saw the FDA being very slow to license diagnostic companies to develop COVID tests when these companies knew exactly what to do. They've been developing tests for decades and they're filled with incredibly smart people. And you saw a lot of political leaders who are used to kind of using the force of their will to bend reality to their liking. And suddenly you're up against something that is bigger than you are and actually way too complex for you to understand. So we saw, certainly in the first few months and so on, we saw all of the limitations of bureaucracy on lurid display. The good news is that in a crisis, power does move out to the periphery. People just give up on the center and they dust off their initiative and they say, okay, let's start to solve this. So what you saw was networks of physicians and caregivers sharing information. They're all connected laterally, figuring out what therapies worked, what tests worked, and coming together. Luckily, that happened. And of course, once the crisis subsides, there will be the tendency to pull back control to the center. But I think that will be harder. I've talked to quite a few CEOs and heads of HR through all of this, and virtually all of them say they are surprised, and they shouldn't have been, but they're surprised at how capable their teams were, how fast they moved. They made some mistakes, but in general got it right. They thought that these people were pretty much helpless until they got some direction from the top, and they figured out that's not the case. I'm hoping this is kind of another nail in the coffin of bureaucracy. I'm hoping that all of those newly empowered employees are not going to soon surrender their prerogatives. And yeah, there'll be more distant working as well, and therefore less kind of direct oversight. I think it'll probably in the end be a positive thing for the evolution of our organizations, but is a hell of a price to pay for kind of facing up to the reality that hierarchical organizations are a liability in a world of hyperkinetic change.
Gary, I have one more question I want to probe you on. I'm going fishing here. I don't know what I'm fishing for, but I'm still looking at pieces of paper in front of me with a lot of really interesting names that praise your work. And so you mentioned you've been in a lot of boardrooms and a lot of the top, Fortune 100, whatnot. Share with me, if you can, a name, an individual, two individuals, a brief bit of insight, something along your journey from one of those names that perhaps we would all recognize that really, I don't know what to say, shaped. I mean, you're kind of your own independent guy, obviously, but one of these people that have come into your life over the last 30 years or so, where you just sat down and you're like, wow, that person really just impressed me, either with what they said to you or their overall moxie. Are there any one or two names or an experience that you had with those individuals that comes to mind you might want to share?
Yeah. I mean, obviously, I have an enormous debt to hundreds and hundreds of leaders and managers that I've interacted with. They've taught me way more than I've taught them, for sure. by and large, the people that have really impressed me have not been CEOs. Not because many of them aren't impressive, but you kind of start with an expectation that they're supposed to be pretty impressive, and it's often hard for them to live up to their advanced billing. I'll give you two simple examples. And again, both were catalytic in my understanding, my intellectual development. 20 years ago, we were working for a Midwestern manufacturing company. They were also struggling in the midst of global competition. We ended up training about 30,000 people in this company how to think like business innovators. So we taught them how to get at unarticulated customer needs and how to see the new things coming around the corner and so on. We were teaching unionized blue collar employees along with everybody else. And amazing ideas, thousands of ideas came out of this work. The company grew, doubled their sales and so on. But one of the things I remember was there was a woman, happened to be an African-American woman who'd been on an assembly line probably for 20 years, a long-serving employee. She came up with a wonderful idea that in the end, I think, became the heart of a $100 million business. What we'd asked these folks to do on one weekend, we took over the space of a suburban shopping mall. We had employees of all ranks go in with their ideas, prototypes, share them with their neighbors, the community, and say, like, what do you think? Give us some feedback. And I remember this woman standing there with her kids around her, so proud of what their mom had done, and she's getting feedback. And I just thought to myself, this is the first time in this person's working career that they were ever asked to use their brain in this way, that anybody ever thought they might be able to imagine and create. I saw that repeated many times over, but I thought, my gosh, what an extraordinary waste. The other thing, a similar thing hit me, this is just a few years ago. I lived in England for a long time. I'm still on the faculty of the London Business School, and I know a little bit about the NHS, Britain's national health system. It employs 1.7 million people. By happenstance, I met an amazing woman, Helen Bevan is her name, and you can find her online and read her work. She's an extraordinary thinker. 2013, Helen was working as a kind of change agent in the middle of the NHS. One evening, sitting with a bunch of young trainee doctors, they were very frustrated by all the bureaucracy. They felt they were spending more time kind of fulfilling internal requests and so on than taking care of patients. And they said, like, how do we change this? It's so frustrating. And Helen launched what would become, I think, the single largest change program in the history of the NHS without a single permission, without going to anybody else. They put up a little thing online and then marketed it through social media, got it viral, but it was just a little form where you could come as an employee, any employee, and make a personal commitment to what you were going to do, a pledge that you would define, that you would do to increase patient care and patient satisfaction. So they put this little platform up, not sure what would happen, but within 3 months, they had 180,000 pledges. And the next year they ran it, they had more than 800,000 pledges. Helen ultimately built an online school called the School for Healthcare Radicals. But what I saw in that, Michael, and I believed it was possible, but I'd never really seen it. What I saw was somebody who changed an extraordinarily large and complicated, not forever and not in every dimension, but had an extraordinary impact despite having very little positional authority at all. That really made me realize that our sense of who is a leader is completely screwed up. When I hear somebody talk about the leadership team, I go, what the hell is that? What do you mean by, you mean the managers who are on the executive committee? Is that who you mean? First, I can tell you, a lot of them aren't leaders, and they sure as hell aren't a team. And for me, my definition of leadership is really simple. A leader is somebody who has a catalytic impact on doing something new and amazing. It's somebody who can mobilize others. And when you look at somebody like Helen, what you find there is courage and compassion and contrarian thinking and somebody who knows how to build community, but you don't see any positional authority at all. One woman, I never knew her name, and Helen I know very well and as a friend. They probably, as much as anybody I could name off the top of my head, they helped me see the world of business in a very, very different way. I've taken a lot out of those experiences. If I can say so, we're at a point in history where the system, the establishment is taking a beating. Whether that is the drain the swamp Trump voters on one side, whether it's all the young people who are lining up or lined up behind Bernie and want to give socialism another chance, whether it is the yellow jacket protesters in France or the five-star movement in Italy, around the world, and more recently, the protests against racial injustice. And what you see here, whether it's left or right, almost was beside the point. What you see is a large number of people who do not believe the system works for them and perhaps never did. And when you look at the data, you understand their perspective. You see in my country, in the United States, We have 44% of jobs are low-wage jobs in the United States. And we know that with each generation, a smaller and smaller number of people are getting into the middle class. You look at this and you say, well, no wonder people are pissed off. If there's a desire in every human heart for dignity and opportunity and equity, people aren't getting that. And if you don't get that at work, I can tell you, you're probably not going to get enough of it in the rest of your life. We've built these organizations that are kind of a caste system where we have the managers and employees, thinkers and doers, the clever and the compliant. And for so many people, there is no chance to grow. And then we talked about the data earlier. I won't go back over the data, but that I think we also have to change. I get enormously frustrated when I hear economists or others talk about low-skilled jobs. I do not think there are any low-skilled jobs in the economy. There are a lot of low-opportunity jobs where people don't have the chance or the incentives or the financial upside to develop and use their skills. But there's no job that is inherently low skilled. I see these people on the front line of Nucor, steel workers. I see people at Morningstar packing agricultural produce, or employees at Southwest Airlines loading bags. None of those people are in low skilled jobs. They're innovating every day. They're improving systems and processes. We have this deep prejudice that comes from the bureaucratic class, the credentialed class, that there are millions upon millions of employees out there who really are just kind of commodities. Sadly, this becomes a self-perpetuating thing, because when you treat people like a commodity, when you put them in a narrow role, when you don't give them much of a chance to grow their skills, when there's no room to innovate, no autonomy, and then you look at them and say, well, they're just kind of semi-programmable robots. Yeah, and what made them that way? I think that we are at a point in history where, not only for competitive reasons, economic reasons, for kind of social reasons, we really have to rethink, what does it mean to be an employee? And what are the opportunities we give you to grow and to flourish as a human being? And unfortunately, bureaucracy denied people those things. Max Weber, the famous German sociologist writing 100 years ago, he said bureaucracy is perfected to the extent it is dehumanized. And we really wanted to turn people into robots. Now today we have robots. We don't need human beings to be robots. I think the threat of automation to employment is entirely dependent on whether we continue to treat human beings like robots. If we do, the robots are going to take those jobs away. If we don't, they're going to innovate and solve problems in a way that robots and AI is not going to be able to do, probably ever, but at least not for another generation or two.
Let me offer you a congratulations here. The congratulations in the sense that you've built a career where you don't have to bite your tongue.
Yeah, well, sometimes when I haven't bitten my tongue, I've gotten bitten in the ass. But yes, mostly that's true.
The book, Humanocracy, Creating Organizations as Amazing as the People Inside Them. We did not go step by step through the book, but look, there's a lot of detail there. There's a lot of processes, philosophies that people can apply to minimize, reduce bureaucracy in their world. So people should check that out. Hey, Gary, is there a website we should send people to?
Yeah, if you go to GaryHamel.com, you can find the book and a whole lot of other content. It's all free, so I'd recommend you go there. I should also note that coming up by the end of July, we're going to have an online course that's about 4 hours of instructional content. It's going to be all free. Many of the people we talked about, my heroes, you can watch the video of them. You can learn from them. Anybody who pre-orders the book between now and then and saves a receipt, you'll get free access to that course starting the end of July. Buy the book, watch the space. We'll let you know how to get access to the course. That will give you just a lot more grist and practical help. You can go through it with a few of your peers and start a revolution in your organization.
Gary, hope you enjoyed your time today. I thank you for giving me your time.
It was a great pleasure, Michael. Thanks for talking to me.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, Trend Following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.